Today I had the honor of interviewing New Democratic Party Member of Parliament Blake Desjarlais. This was my first time interviewing a politician. I was very nervous, but very grateful that Blake took the time to talk to me about the Canada Disability Benefit. I also realized that I forgot to ask Blake to give his contact information. So at the end of this video, as well as in the description of this video, I will post the contact information and social media information for Blake Desjarlais. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day and enjoy the interview. Thank you so much for joining me, Blake. I'm really glad to have you here to talk about the Canada Disability Benefit. Blake Desjarlais is the MP, new Democratic Party MP for Edmonton Griesbach, which, by the way, is actually my sister's riding. I was really excited
Oh,
when she
nice.
moved into your riding. How are you doing today, Blake?
I am doing good. It's the summertime for us. We rose from Parliament and we sit a huge amount of time during the year in Ottawa. And so when we get to come home, it's a really good opportunity for us to, as members of Parliament, to connect with our constituents, go door knocking, and to answer questions like the ones you're going to be asking us today.
Absolutely. Well, I really appreciate you being here, and I will get started with the question. So, the first question that I have about the Canada Disability Benefit is, what was the original intent of the Canada Disability Benefit from your own understanding?
Well, in my early discussions with the government, the Liberal members of Parliament, and the minister at that time, Minister Qualtrough, which I know you know from your time as part of the Advisory Council and many other members across our province and across our country who are familiar with Minister Qualtrough. She had spoken to me about the importance of this piece of legislation that she would, quote, want to lift people out of poverty, particularly uh, as we are in this affordability crisis. People are falling really far behind. We see that inflation is quite high. Corporate greed is taking the lion's share of people's paychecks, of people's support income, and that means less support for things like food, like rent, and the things that people need. And so I recognized that it was a really important piece, part of our social safety net, that was going to make sure that people could live their fullest and potential lives with dignity. That's a human right. It's a fundamental human right that Canada has acknowledged both at the United Nations and even here in Canada, that persons with disabilities should not have to forego their dignity in order to live a meaningful life in Canada. And part of that is making sure that as a country, Canada, wealthy, top wealthiest countries in the globe, a G7 country, could make financially available the resources to make sure that those human rights demands and pressing needs were actually addressed by lifting thousands of people out of poverty and contributing to a more robust society, a more robust economy. And that was the original intent in my mind and how I think about the Canada Disability Benefit and what it's intended, or at least was intended to do. Of course, we know today that it largely failed to meet those expectations and is failing to adequately address the human rights concerns of disability advocates across the country.
They completely let us down and just put us in a situation where, like you said, our human rights were put to the wayside. And to that point, as you know, a lot of money went into the consultation with the disability community on the regulations. I was actually part of that consultation. The two biggest things that we said were the disability tax credit cannot be an eligibility requirement because too many people don't qualify for it, and the monetary value of the benefit must put people over the poverty line. As you know, the Liberal government seemingly ignored the biggest feedback we gave them. Why do you think they ignored our feedback? And were you surprised by the budgeted amount for the Canada Disability Benefit?
Those are two great questions, Mike, and I did want to start that off by thanking you for your time your energy and your thought and organizing and making sure that the disability community had a real voice at the table. And you did your part. The community did their part. They did the hardest part in this whole process, which is to recommend a framework and policy goals that would actually make this benefit work for people. And the two biggest concerns that I often hear from disability advocates, including from the report that you folks have, including yourself personally, have contributed to, is the eligibility criteria and the financial amount. The eligibility criteria, who gets the benefit, is one of the most important pieces to making sure that we lift as many people who are living with a disability out of poverty as possible. If we make that pool too narrow, we run the risk of duplicating the legacy of leaving people behind, and it fails to meet its objective there. The second part is the financial amount, that if we don't have the appropriate financial amount to lift people out of poverty, then no one is going to be lifted out of poverty. Two very obvious and important pillars to what could be a really strong disability benefit. These most important pieces to it largely failed. And I think they failed. I'll speak on the financial part first. In the House of Commons, it's a really volatile environment where we have four parties. We have the Liberals, the Conservatives, New Democrats, and the Bloc Québécois, and of course the two members of the Green Party. And so we're stuck with this really tough decision where we don't actually get to vote on the ideal. We get to vote on the option between what is in front of us and what could be worse. We don't get to vote on what could be better. And so that's the really tough part that I often face difficulty with as a parliamentarian. And what I suspect happened was that the Liberal government, was under severe pressure by the Conservatives to cut the budget. They are the official opposition, meaning they are the second largest party in Canada, the most likely party to form a government. And so if an election were called. And so it's very likely that the Liberals were nervous and fell victim to the fears and the I'd say propaganda that the Conservatives were spouting, that if we were to help people by making sure that they had access to financial means, that would in some way equate to bankrupting the country. Those were the narratives that they were speaking, that the more we help regular Canadians, whether that's dental care, pharmacare, or the Canada Disability Benefit, the more that Canada would see the increase in the cost of living, the increase in government taxes. That's an outright lie that we have to push back against. Canada is one of the wealthiest countries in the globe. And so many reports, whether it's the Guaranteed Basic Livable Income study that my colleague Leah Gazan has headed up, it shows us point blank and clearly that the more we lift people out of poverty, the better our economy gets. And that's because we still pay for poverty. We pay for that at the hospitals. We pay for that on the streets. We pay for that everywhere where people who don't have the dignity to support their own living, they find themselves relying on emergency services that are 6 times the cost of preventative services. And so we need to push back against that narrative. And the Liberals fell victim to that in the House of Commons. They were told that spending money on programs that were going to help people was going to hurt the economy, was going to hurt every Canadian. And that's the reason I attribute to why they inevitably put the Canada Disability Benefit at just $200. Like that's legislated poverty. It doesn't hit the mark. It is a betrayal to the community. And it also shows us that when the Liberals made a promise, that they were more concerned about their opposition than they were about keeping their promises. And so that to me is a double betrayal. One, a betrayal to Canadians who expect to see thousands lifted out of poverty through this benefit, and another betrayal to the people who vote for every party in our country because they expect that their MPs are going to fight for them. And what the Conservatives had done was make fear out of the Canada Disability Benefit and made fear out of spending to put more money in people's pockets. And it had the result it did, which was a low amount that even today the Conservatives are still mad about. They want to see the abolition of the Canada Disability Benefit, and argue that the family unit is the most important social safety net. We disagree with that largely because we know that not every family has the ability to make up the difference of cost for their loved ones. And so that's where we fundamentally disagree. When it comes to the eligibility part, that was part of your recommendation. We fully agree that we cannot use the very barrier, it's a serious barrier, both financial barrier and reporting barrier that the Canada Disability Tax Credit provides. For someone to have to apply for the Canada Disability Tax Credit in order for them to get this benefit, the cost of that application to do that and the time it takes to go see a doctor and get a written note is well above the cost of the monthly payment for the benefit itself. And so I can't see why anyone would want to go through all of that just to get nothing in return, and it's a serious issue. That's why I really supported my colleague from Victoria, MP Laurel Collins, in her private members bill to do away with the requirements of the Canada Disability Tax Credit for the purposes of the disability benefit. We believe that should you already be in receipt of existing disability benefits at the provincial level, that you should automatically, without let or hindrance or barrier, be submitted to the new Canada Disability Benefit. It makes the most sense. It's the easiest sense. Just like when a senior turns 65 in Canada, they automatically are enrolled in the OAS, Old Age Security. That is a good program. Why not just do what works best for people? Why make more barriers when we know we can deliver support to those who need it most? Because we already have their names. All we have to do is sign the check.
You brought up quite a few great points there. When you talk about how it's less money to, actually fix a problem than put a band-aid on it. I have seen that so many times in terms of building shelters, in terms of doing all of these things that put a band-aid on the problem but don't actually solve the problem. And I don't know how we change that mentality. I don't know how we change that idea that it's somehow cheaper and more economically sound to keep people in poverty. I don't know how we change that. And kind of had a hint that maybe the Liberals were falling to their conservative opposition when it came to funding the benefit, and maybe that was why they didn't do as much as they should have. But as somebody who has actually voted Liberal for many years because of false promises, I personally think that part of the upset from the disability community is because the Liberal government is supposed to help people. That's what they said they were going to do. They were going to come out and help people, and then they not only blindsided us and gaslit us, but they're also not taking accountability for it. Right? They keep saying, "Oh, we did the right thing, and look how amazing we are for this benefit that we created." But no, just come out and be honest with us. And I think a lot of people would appreciate that.
Oh, I totally agree. And I'm a big Indigenous rights activist as well, and it happens to us all the time where they take us for granted. That's what I think it is. They simply take us for granted. They say in their own minds, they're never going to vote conservative, so they're going to vote for us. So we might as well deliver the very least amount possible in order to appease some people and to create a divided community. And that's the toughest part, I think, that so many who need a progressive government speak about, is the fact that it's kind of like a bait and switch. They speak to the needs of Canadians, and they speak to the human rights that we need to be protected and implemented, but then they govern out of fear by the Conservatives, they govern that way, and it aggravates me to the max. And I can only imagine the many thousands of persons with disabilities who feel just completely betrayed, but also taken for granted, because the disability community is one of the largest voting blocs in Canada. It is one of the most powerful advocacy communities in North America. And for them to be taken for granted like this is, I think, one of the most extreme examples of not just betrayal, but of how insidious governments can be when they say one thing at time of an election, but at the time of governing are completely different people. And that, I think, is the hard part for many Canadians to swallow.
Yeah, and to that point, it's interesting to me, and it's always been interesting that we are such a huge part of the population that is voting in these elections, but yet I feel like a lot of times we're the ones that don't get talked about. We're the
Hmm.
ones that kind of get pushed to the side and we're not mentioned in political speeches, and they don't want to understand that we are a big part of their base, and they need to actually talk to us and take accountability for that. The next question that I have, and kind of goes along with this, is there's many people in the disability community who are quite upset that you and the NDP party voted for the 2024 budget. Some feel betrayed by the NDP because of that. Can you explain why you and your party colleague voted the way that you did?
And that's a great question. And I think it's an important one. And it's the reason why I wanted to speak to you today, because I think this is the most important question for New Democrats, one of the most important questions for people who stand in the House of Commons and vote. The reason why we felt as though we needed to vote in favor of the budget, at least me personally, and I know from some of my colleagues who share that opinion, is something that I mentioned a bit earlier. When we stand in the House of Commons for New Democrats, it's so often a choice that is a choice between what is in front of us or worse. It's never a choice of what is in front of us or better. It's always a choice of what is in front of us or worse. And what I mean by that is when the government tabled the budget, we were disappointed on many, many fronts. We were disappointed with the lack of Indigenous housing infrastructure, $0 for Indigenous housing. We were upset that there was no tax revenue increase on the ultra wealthy in Canada to help fuel some of the programs, so we don't have to continue to tax burden most Canadians. We were disappointed that we've seen a continual disregard for those who are living in poverty in Canada, and most particularly the Canadians with disability. And so when we seen the $200, we were flabbergasted. We honestly almost thought that you might as well have put $0. Honestly, you might as well just not have done it at all if this was going to be the slap in the face that your message was, the message that the government was sending was going to be. But like I said before, it's still a decision between what's in front of us and worse. When I imagine the outcome of what would be us defeating the budget, that would strike an election. And at the time of the vote, it would have likely meant a conservative government that has vowed to cut social spending, that has vowed to cut programs and services, that has vowed to ask Canadians to pull up their bootstraps and do it themselves. That the government was out of business, out of the business of helping Canadians, and in the business of becoming smaller and becoming an agency of less support. And so that was my fear. When I had to debate that, it's like the devil you know versus the devil you don't. And that's the worst position, I think, that New Democrats are often faced with. For like the 157 years of Canada, that is like I don't want to say bread and butter, but that is like the generational challenge we always have. Whether it was Tommy Douglas, who was like, I want free Medicare in Canada for all, but he had to accept an insurance program. Or if it was Jack Layton when he said, I want housing for all in 2011, but he had to accept several billions of dollars that was going to house, 12% of Canadians. That's still better than 0% of Canadians. And so when we took a look at the budget, we had to really seriously contemplate and imagine this legislative framework that exists, the Canada Disability Benefit. It's amendable, it is workable, and it's something that if we were to form government would save us a lot of time to amend. And so ultimately, I personally believe that it is a difficult decision to make between what is in front of us and what is worse, but we chose to vote what was in front of us rather than go down the path of what could ultimately be worse. And it's a great commitment and vow that I personally share from this experience, that one of the very first things we would do in government is immediately amend that legislation, immediately increase the benefit so that at the very least we see $20,000 annually to persons with disabilities, so that we can get our economy back on track, that we can chart out a future where we actually stand up to the commitments we've made at the international level, at the United Nations in the Convention for Disability Rights, and become a leader across the globe and say that the age of eugenics, the age of saying who belongs, and the age of saying who gets to be successful and who doesn't is over. That we believe in true equity, true equality, and we're going to show the world what that looks like because it's true. The Canadians living with a disability are not a liability to Canadians. They are the answer to what is a just and equitable future. And they hold the solutions and key to making sure that no matter who you are, where you live, what your abilities are, or who you love, that we can actually be in a world where we can coexist. And I think that's the world I want to live in. That's the world most Canadians want to live in. And I think that's the world that we expect at a time when we see wealth at its highest levels ever, but yet only the wealthiest in the world, the 67 billionaires in Canada, get to enjoy. We believe fundamentally that if we were to form a government, if we were to go from 25 seats to 170 seats, that this would be part of our immediate priorities because it speaks to the fundamental need of a better Canada and would actually, like we spoke before, supply our economy with a chance to recover.
Absolutely. Yeah, and what you were saying about that initial thought that it would have been better to just not fund the benefit, that was my initial thought too, put the
Mm-hmm.
money towards something that's actually going to help people. But I also completely understand the position that you were put in. And, it's interesting. I've been asked so many times if I would ever run for politics, and I can't. Like, literally, it would affect my mental health because I care so deeply that I couldn't be put in that situation. So I commend you and I appreciate you and the work that you are trying to do.
And I totally appreciate the many people who are frustrated with us for that decision. And I fully know that that is the motivation I hold to making the Canada Disability Benefit work. It's a it's long overdue, and it's a kind of repeated injustice that um, we can't undo, but it's something that in the future we can make better. And that I think is fundamental to what could be if I were to become Minister of Canadians living with disability. That would be the first course of action we would do, be the very first bill we would present.
I greatly appreciate that, and I'm sure that so many others do as well. You talked about eugenic, and so I wanted to talk a bit about MAID as well. One of the biggest things that I've seen talked about on Twitter, especially, is how the Canada Disability Benefit was supposed to lessen the strain on the second track of medical assistance in dying, or MAID. Given the outcome of the budget, some are saying that this is a form of eugenic. You create a benefit for certain people and at the same time create MAID for those who don't qualify. Not that that was the intent, just that that's how some people feel. Are you concerned that if the benefit isn't changed, that we could see a huge increase in people applying for and being approved for MAID? And if so, what is the alternative solution that the NDP would want to see implemented?
That's a great question, and it's just deplorable to imagine that Canada in the 21st century has put people in this position where they have to debate in their own minds whether or not living without dignity is better or worse than not being on this planet. It speaks to the fundamental issue of why the disability benefit is needed. If we don't increase the benefit, if we don't truly lift people out of poverty, this becomes the alternative, whether that is by intent or not. That becomes the truth. And we need to do far more for people before they are made eligible for MAID under the second track. When we had to vote, and I got a lot of people angry that I voted with the Conservatives on delaying the implementation date of the second track of MAID, which would allow eligibility for persons with disabilities. When I stood up and voted to delay that, we got a lot of flack for that because the Liberals were upset that we would join the Conservatives in doing that. But my position at that time was we cannot allow that second track to become a process where people see that as the solution to their indignity that they're suffering. We have to do everything we possibly can to ensure that the first option, which is the most preferable option, which is to lift people out of poverty, to make sure that people are living with dignity, is truly explored and implemented before something like MAID is contemplated by expansion. And I think that's an important piece of this. So the solution in my mind is to hold true to the promises that were made by the government, which is to implement a disability benefit that doesn't force people to have to make that kind of decision. I think that's the solution. I think the Canada Disability Benefit is the solution to people's feelings of hopelessness, to their experience of poverty, and ultimately will stop them from even contemplating MAID as a solution to their very real human suffering. And I think that is the fundamental solution to making sure that this type of legislated poverty does not persist. It's true that if we do not act, if we do not lift people out of poverty, if we do not ensure that there's dignity for all, the option for MAID as a way to alleviate human suffering becomes a form of eugenics, because that form of eugenics is made real by the very obvious lack of support for those who are experiencing their worst outcomes. And when I go door knocking, I often find people who are living and experiencing disability. And they are doing so much, like literally, like on Facebook, asking people for, bottles just to make ends meet. That is deplorable when we know that huge mega corporations have never been richer in Canada. Those two things existing in our country at the same time is completely unacceptable. We need to make sure that those who are benefiting grossly from our system are held accountable and support Canadians when they need help. And that's the answer to conservatives who say we can't afford to help people. We can't afford to make sure that the Canada Disability Benefit is realized. We say no to that kind of rhetoric because we know the wealth of this country. We know the extreme billions of dollars that are being generated just the last 5 years alone. And so for us to think that funding the Canada Disability Benefit properly is impossible is outlandish. It is not true, and it is a form of misdirection away from what is the true source of relief here, which is to simply make sure that those in our country have the means to pay for their rent, to pay for food, and maybe save a little bit so that they can have a vacation, that they can enjoy this beautiful world we live in. Because everyone in this planet, everyone in our country is here for a reason. They're here to share in an experience. They're here to share with one another. And they're here to make this place better for the next generation, no matter who you are. And that means making sure that we don't leave anyone behind. In my mind, it is a hallmark, the fact that we failed so greatly at making sure this benefit was successful, a hallmark to Canada's deeply troubling past of eugenics. And I think that we need to find a moment to rectify this. And it begins with an apology. And I think that is where the government must start, by acknowledging the truth here and saying, sorry, we fell victim to conservative pressure. We fell victim to economic concerns that were not true. And we cowered at a moment when we needed to stand stronger for all Canadians. Because as much as people might say that the Canada Disability Benefit is only for people with disabilities, you mentioned it earlier, Mike, it's not just for Canadians with disabilities. This is for our economy. This is for Canada. The more we support those who need support at the preventative level, the more we save at hospitals, the more we save on infrastructure, the more we save on transition housing, the more we save on so many more fronts, that the Canada Disability Benefit would actually save us and our economy billions of dollars if we were to have just implemented it fairly and paid the cost, which is about a 1-to-6 cost ratio, meaning that if we spent, for every $1 we spend on the Canada Disability Benefit, $6 we save in overall government spending. That's a huge savings, and one that I cannot fathom why the Liberals did this, other than falling pressure to what is the very large lobby of those who say helping our neighbors is wrong, and that largely comes from the official opposition.
Absolutely. And it wouldn't only help the economy in that sense, but also people with disabilities are the largest minority in not just in Canada, but in the world. And it's a demographic that intersects with every other demographic. And that means that we are a huge part of the consumer market. So by not funding this benefit and not helping us be able to lift us out of poverty, that is a huge risk to the consumer economy as well.
Oh, huge. We're taking millions, if not billions, of people out of the economy.
Yeah, and I completely agree with you. I think that it has to start with an apology from the government. I mean, I would have still been hard on them, but I feel like I would have been slightly less hard on them if they had come out and said, hey, we ran into these barriers with this benefit. I know we promised you this, but this is why we couldn't deliver, and this is how we're going to live up to that promise, and we're going to fix this because we understand that it's an important benefit.
And they have the power. They have the power to do it. In Alberta alone, if we just look at Alberta's little, small economy, which is a fraction of Canada's overall economy, we see Alberta posting tens of billions of dollars in surplus. Tens of billions of dollars in surplus. The amount of money it would have taken to make sure that everyone experiencing a disability in Canada and the amount of money it would have taken to lift them out of poverty would still mean we were in a surplus. Just in Alberta alone, our country is just a fraction of what Alberta's surplus is.
Absolutely. There's a lot of people, myself included, that just feel completely taken advantage of and betrayed by the Liberal government, and it made us feel hopeless and uncertain about the future. So, what would be your advice for people like myself and many other Canadians that feel this way?
I first start by saying that it's an important piece to the human thought process and to the human experience to let oneself feel that rage, feel that anger, feel that betrayal. But it's the most important step after that to turn that betrayal, that feeling, into hope. That is the hardest part of organizing in Canada. That is the hardest part of organizing for any project, anytime, ever, is making sure that we can use that energy because it's legitimate energy. That energy is within everyone who believed that this benefit was going to happen. All that energy can be translated into real action and hope. It can become a process of not just socialization, where we speak to one another about how we feel, which is what this is. This is a project of socialization. Me and Mike talking about this process in a 3-part process that I've always fundamentally believed in my mind of making change, which is to socialize, get to know one another, talk to each other, share one's experience, listen to one another. The second part is to organize. Say, how are we going to make certain that all of these voices who are now angry can come together and formulate a plan towards change? What does that look like? Let's write that down. Let's ask the NDP members of Parliament that if the Liberals can't do it and the Conservatives won't do it, they must do it. Let's demand from them in their platform when they go to the polls that you must guarantee that this benefit is amended within the first 180 days if you form a government. The first 180 days will see the implementation under the first budget of a fair and equitable Canada Disability Benefit with the appropriate amount that is required to truly lift people out of poverty. And then mobilize. That's the last step. Mobilize. Then go out and tell your neighbors. Go door knocking, volunteer on a campaign and say, listen to your neighbors. We have an opportunity at the next federal election to make what seems impossible today possible. And we need your help. We need you to support this candidate, whoever they are, in making sure that they can form a government towards these ends in 180 days. And if we do, or if any party fails to deliver that promise like the Liberals have, we must have the courage to vote them out. That is the accountability that's required in Canada, and that is how we communicate to parties that we will not be taken for granted anymore. That when you don't do what we demanded, that we went to the polling station for, then we will use our power. We will use the legitimate power we have to vote someone else in that will do the job. Because the reality in our democratic country of Canada is that the Prime Minister has no power unless people vote for them. And when the next election is called within the next 12 to 16 months, this is the most important time to make sure that we organize towards those demands. And so I'd say the way we build hope, the way we build courage, and the way we build success is socialize. Talk to everyone in the disability community and beyond that, our allies, our neighbors. Then organize. What are our demands? How do we get parties to accept this in their platform? I want to see it on page 1 of the platform of these parties. And then 3, let us mobilize. We're going to go door to door. We're going to go online like you are, Mike. We're going to go to every space possible to speak about why it's important to elect that person. And that is how we change the country. That's how healthcare became a priority in Canada. That's how pharmacare became a reality. That's how dental care became a reality. And I think that's how the Canada Disability Benefit will truly become a reality and a hallmark, literally could be the most successful piece of legislation we have in the country. That would send a message to the globe that the world is changing and that it's time for people living with a disability to truly take their rightful place in our country and in the globe. And I just can only imagine the solutions and help that will come from that level of inclusion.
Absolutely. And I would say to anybody watching, don't let other people tell you that the Liberals are the safe choice. Because they're not. Like, there's alternatives to the Liberal Party. And I think sometimes I feel like people in my own life try to say, oh, we'll vote Liberal because they're at least better than the Conservatives. Well, not if they're taking advantage of us, and not if they're stabbing us in the back. And there's other alternatives to them that, actually want to help and actually can help if we, like you said, if we elect them in and if we stand up and say, no, this is a better alternative.
And demand it. We've never formed a government in Canada, the New Democrats, nor has the Green Party. We've never formed a government in Canada. But imagine what the government could look like if you set the agenda, if you set the platform objectives of those parties, and that they weren't going to take you for granted. I know that's my commitment to the community, is that I will personally champion the Canada Disability Benefit in our federal NDP platform come the next federal election, that we will have a commitment to increase the benefit and show Canadians what's possible. And I hope that that's not because we feel that that's an electorally smart thing to do, but it's because we feel it's a matter of fundamental human rights, that it's a matter of ensuring that we end what is a very dark chapter in Canada, which is the reality that we have second-class citizens living amongst us who are continuously devalued. And it's a critical matter of human rights, and it's a critical matter of making sure that all Canadians are treated with dignity, because we cannot live in a world where some of us are excluded and others are included. That kind of exclusion sets the stage for a future where not everyone can thrive, and is a future I don't want to belong to.
Yeah, to that point, our community has to rise up, and even though so many politicians, so many people in general have made us feel less than, and like we have no power, we do have power. We just have to use it and realize that we have it and vote for the NDP.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Yes, if you give us a chance, if you lend us your vote, if you give us your vote, if you give us the opportunity, we will make most certain that this will happen. And even better yet, some members of the community need to run. We need members to run. We need your voices. We need Parliament to look like Canada. That's why I ran, to make sure that young Indigenous youth knew that it's possible, that our voices matter. And that's the same we need from the disability community. We need to have you in chairs in the House of Commons so that when the decisions about you are being made, that you are in the room to say yes, or you are in the room to say no. That is one of the most fundamental parts to that. And if anyone needs help wanting to apply for candidacy wherever you may live, reach out to my office. I'd be happy to walk through the steps or have a chat with you about how you can get involved and put your name on a ballot for justice in Canada.
Well, that is amazing. Thank you so much, Blake. And I 100% agree. We definitely need more people in our community in Parliament and in government. I want to thank you so much for your time, Blake. I truly appreciate it, and I appreciate you and all the work that you're doing. So, thank you so much.
Thank you, Mike. I appreciate you. Thank you for everything you've done and for continuously teaching and sharing wisdom in such a compassionate but also strong way.
Well, thank you, Blake.